Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And happy International Day of Consent. My name's Kat Murthy. I'm the Executive Director of Feminists for Liberty, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. Feminists for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit leading a new wave of an old idea that people should be treated equally under the law, regardless of their gender or their sex. We are anti-sexism, anti-statism, pro-markets, and pro-choice in everything. We share many of the same concerns as mainstream feminists, but have a much more libertarian approach to solving them, and believe that the best means of creating change in society isn't based on coercion, criminalization, censorship, or bigger government. If feminism is the radical notion that women are people, libertarian feminism is the even more radical notion that people of all genders are individuals and should be treated as such. Today is the third annual International Day of Consent, which was started a couple of years ago in 2018 by Jenny Wilson of Irregular Arts and consentculture.co.uk. This year, Wilson is joined by Kitty Stryker, founder of consentculture.com and editor of Ask, Building Consent Culture. And together they created a 2-week-long online international festival of consent, featuring artists, activists, and academics exploring the bounds of consent culture, all of which culminates tonight with this panel. The hashtag for the festival is #IDoConsent, and I highly encourage all of you to use it to join the conversation across social media. Centering the principle of consent in personal interactions and public policy is one of the key principles of libertarian feminism. And we at Feminists for Liberty frequently say that liberty is consent culture applied to everything. Our panelists tonight are bound to have some very interesting thoughts for all of you on that, and I hope you'll enjoy the discussion. Please feel free to post your questions in the comments box that you should see in the corner of your screen, and we'll be sure to save time for them in the end. Now, to introduce you to our excellent panelists, many of whom you may already know. Up first, Elizabeth Nolan Brown is the co-founder and president of Feminists for Liberty. Elizabeth is also senior editor at Reason Magazine, where she writes regularly on the intersections of sex, speech, tech, crime, politics, panic, and civil liberties. She's also won multiple awards for her writing on the US government's war on sex. Elizabeth?
Hi.
We also have Avens O'Brien. Avens is a second-generation libertarian activist. She's the founder of the Not That Kind of Feminist, a Facebook group for feminist and non-feminist folks to critically analyze and discuss news and culture related to feminism, and is a member of the Feminists for Liberty Board of Directors. Avens?
Hi.
We also have Kathy Reisenwetz. Kathy's known for her writing on sex and relationships, including the Sex and the State newsletter and a regular column in Kink and Code. She is VP of Comms for San Francisco's Sex Positive Democratic Club and speaks on topics of economic freedom, Bitcoin, and feminism. Kathy?
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks. And last but not least, we have Leslie Ann Peterson. Leslie stands at the intersection of mental health, alternative relationships, and liberty activism. She believes that a world based in peace and non-aggression starts with ourselves and our relations to those around us. Leslie, thanks for joining us.
Hi.
So y'all, let's start out with the big elephant in the room. What exactly does it mean when we say libertarianism is consent culture?
I'll start.
Let's go with Kathy first.
I think that it means that libertarianism tends to prioritize and kind of almost sanctify the idea that interaction should be voluntary. And these interactions, whether they're in the economic realm or the sexual realm or the whatever kind of realm, that everyone entering into them should be doing so of their own free will and without force, fraud, or coercion.
Avens, if you're trying to talk, your sound seems to be off.
I just bingo. Like that's exactly it. I think Kathy summed it up beautifully.
Actually, I will tell you that, Alvins, you were the first one that I heard that phrase from. I heard you say it at Pork Fest several years ago, and I was like, yes, actually, yes.
I said that I hung over at a panel on women in liberty on at Pork Fest. But yeah, it's something that I've constantly thought about, is like, as I spend time in feminist spaces and people talk about consent, I thought about the fact that like as a libertarian, I'm fighting for the most voluntary world possible. And so when I look at any issue, you know, like what's the difference between, you know, and God, I can't even believe I'm going to go here, but because libertarians are obsessed with taxes, like what's the difference between like, you know, charity and taxation is like the consent, right? I can give my money away, but like if someone takes it, and that applies to everything. That applies to, you know, our business transactions, our personal relationships, and our sexual relationships. Which is what Kathy just said. So there I go, saying it again, because it was worth saying twice. But yes, I do. I very much remember saying that at Pork Fest in 2017, and then I saw it start happening on our on all of our little media for this, and I was like, thank you, me.
I didn't know that was you, but almost like Kat wrote it on a poster for a slogan. We went to the Women's March the first time. The second year of the Women's March, our first time, and it was like on a poster, and a lot of people liked it, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a really great slogan. I didn't realize that you were the origin.
I honestly have to partially credit my partner Judd for that, because the two of us were talking about this issue, and it kind of became this brainchild of the two of us going like, you know, libertarian is consent culture, consent applied to everything. And so yeah, that was honestly like, it was something that he and I had been talking about a couple of weeks prior, and then it popped up in that panel.
So I mean, just hearing that story, so then what does it mean so if consent culture is kind of like the big thing that's easy to explain libertarianism through, what is consent culture?
Hit that one?
Is that the harder question?
I mean, what's funny is I would think, if I would consider consent culture, I mean, there's a much more complex answer that someone else could possibly provide. But, you know, as I say, libertarianism is fighting for the most voluntary world possible, and consent culture is about creating the resources and capabilities to provide that. Like, what is consent culture to me? It's about teaching people how to have conversations about consent, how to have conversations about boundaries, how to have conversations about respect, like how to listen and hear other people's boundaries. All of those things are intertwined in that. And so when I think of consent culture, I'm thinking of like, how do I make human interaction as voluntary as possible? How do I make it so that like we're not imposing on each other, coercing each other, and we're getting what we want while respecting what other people want, and, you know, and not imposing upon them. And so that's why it's so funny, because to me these two things are just so the same. You know, it's you know, libertarianism can be dry and applied to a very particular thing, and consent culture, you know, like it's really come about with sexual conversations and relationship related stuff, but you know, it then delves into other parts of our lives. Even like if you just start with like sex and relationships, and then you start going like outside and you go into the consent related to women's bodies around, you know, pregnancy and reproduction and things like that, and then you extend to that like the way that people parent and consent in our interactions with children and things, and it then, you know, proceeds through the entire spectrum of human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one thing that just to add to that consent culture should be, and this is something that I think that libertarianism and feminism can both benefit from, is not only should consent culture be an emphasis on the importance of consent, which I think that feminism and libertarianism generally do a pretty good job of, but I think it should be an emphasis on the importance of defining and understanding consent correctly. And so this is where I think that we have work to do, in that I think there's a huge tendency for us to see consent as a binary. This interaction was consensual or it wasn't. And I think lived experience and any kind of critical thought leads us to the conclusion that it's not, it's a spectrum. That consent is a spectrum, that there is a far end that's outright force, fraud, and coercion, a gun to your head. There is the other side of the spectrum where you're entering into it fully autonomous, fully informed, with all your options in front of you. And then there's the middle, and that's where most interactions lie. And so the goal isn't to make sure every interaction is cooperative so much as it is to bring more interactions toward the more cooperative end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what hits on it for me. Like, I think about this all the time. It's a lot of the frustrations, a lot of the issues that people have around consent, a lot of the fears, all of that comes from the fact that fundamentally people don't really fully understand what is consent and like what does it mean for something to be consensual or non-consensual. And even two people in the same interaction might have a very different read on if something's consensual or not.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I've always
Go ahead,
Leslie,
sorry.
were you saying something?
I've always viewed it in terms of like gray consent. Like it's not fully consensual, but it's on the spectrum. And I saw that title of your piece pop up in my email, Kathy, and I just haven't gotten around to reading it. The consent is non-binary. But I get the point now that you said it, because it's like, oh, that sounds so intriguing. But I think I like that framework more because it allows for this gradient without shaming people for being in the gray area. And I feel like a lot of people, particularly men in male-dominated circles, tend to feel shame, internalized shame, if they fall in the gray area and don't want to admit past faults. And I think this applies to all of us, but some men in particular. And I think this framework is going to help if we can try to change the language around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I liked this phrase because I think that it can mean a lot of different things. I like hearing, what consent culture means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and you can interpret libertarianism is consent culture in a lot of ways. One way that I think I look at it is just that it can be a good framework for explaining. I mean, as Kathy and Ovens both said, it can be a good framework for explaining libertarianism to people, and I think it's a good framework for looking at where government should be involved in things. Because again, we always talk about consent usually in the realm of sexual things, but if you look at it in economic arrangements or really other sort of non-sexual relationship arrangements, or just a wide variety of things. If you look at should this be an area for criminalization or an appropriate area for government criminalization or government action in any way, that's a good lens. And so because consent is hard and it is non-binary, determining where that is sort of the hard work of this whole thing, I think. But I think that looking at everything through that, not just sexual things, is a good way to explain sort of what the whole libertarian project with relation to where we think government should act is all about.
That's actually a really great point to transition into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is what are some of the ways in which consent applies non-sexually? What are the non-sexual ways in which we should be thinking about consent? And I know that we sort of touched upon this already. I can tell you, and this ties back into the first question for me, but as a libertarian, I see the whole world through the lens of consent. And so for me, every interaction is about consent. But I think that's not the case for everybody. That's certainly not the case for most people. So when we're talking about consent, we want to talk about non-sexual consent, not non-consensual, non-sexual consent. What types of things would you highlight or bring out for people?
I mean, one thing would be a labor agreement, right? So if you are going into an agreement with a potential employer and you have a lot of options and you are very clear on what you're agreeing to, then you're coming into it with more consent. If you are going into a labor agreement with an employer and you have very few options and you don't fully understand what you're agreeing to, then you're entering into it with less consent. And so I think, again, it's a spectrum. And so, force, fraud, and coercion are just kind of generalized terms that we use to describe ways that things can be more or less consensual. But essentially what we mean is kind of power and knowledge. And so how consensual an interaction is, whether it's agreeing to hang out with someone or agreeing to work for someone or agreeing to move in with someone or signing a lease or whatever the agreement is, power really kind of determines in a lot of ways whether and to what extent the agreement is consensual.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
So I think another one of the classic libertarian examples for this is personal liberty laws. So, like, sex work criminalization is a great example, and not within the sexual consent, but within the the labor agreement that's happening, the exchange of product for money.
I think it's really interesting. I don't know if this is going to come up later and I'm jumping the gun, but I think it's really interesting how the left and the right kind of both believe that sex changes how consent works in a kind of fundamental, basic
Sex
way.
and money.
Right. And so it's almost like the left thinks that it's not consensual because of the money, and the right thinks it's not consensual because of the sex when it comes to sex work. But it's actually consensual or not consensual because of the power. Like that's what makes it consensual or not consensual, not the sex or the money. But I do think that it's important for us to understand that sex does change consent because of the way that we interact with sex in our society, right? It's difficult to have a fully consensual agreement if both people don't know what they're consenting to, if both people aren't on the same page. And because we are so weird and squeamish and stigmatizing of sex, it makes it hard for us to come in fully on the same page. We're not willing to talk about it in clear and straightforward terms. And so our squeamishness and squickiness around sex makes consent harder to establish and maintain. Nothing inherent about sex. It's the way that we deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of this might come up a little bit later, but I think a lot of the tensions that we're seeing in society now, where people are sort of like through the Me Too movement and things like that, we're kind of at that point where we're finally starting to discuss a lot of things that were sort of expected over time, and cultural norms have changed a lot. And yet, because of our squeamishness about sex, we largely don't discuss how those norms may or may not have changed. And I think that leads to, honestly, a lot of heartache for a lot of people.
To go just a few more examples of consent in other realms. I think one is the sort of the right to try issue with long medications that have been based, that show a lot of promise and have been proven safe, have been shown to be safe or whatever, but not to the satisfaction of the FDA, and people not being allowed to try them even if it's they're going to die anyways. So just things like that, like with regard to consenting to medical treatments, even if the FDA doesn't think you're allowed, consenting to consuming certain foods, even if the FDA thinks they're dangerous. And then just back to the economic thing. I mean, that is obviously the big one that comes to mind. And sort of drilling down a little bit, I think a lot about the sort of gig economy issue, where people really think that if people really workers tend to really love this concept because they get to choose their own hours, because of the flexibility, blah blah blah, because it isn't traditional employment. And yet you have like a lot of people in government who just want to impose the will and say, no, everyone needs to have this 9-to-5 structure, this sort of employment arrangement, and people cannot consent to these things. And I think we can argue over the conditions in all of these groups, all of these different companies and things like that. But the bottom line comes down to, consent between workers and whether or not they agree to these different contracts. And also, well, actually, yeah.
Well, no, I think that actually ties back to Kathy's point about sex work as well, right? Like both of those kind of come from this very like centrally planned vision of like, well, I wouldn't want to work like that. Yeah. So no one would want to work like that.
Right. And I saw that too. I mean, it comes often too when we talked about, just real quick, nail salons, like in New York City were a big deal a few years ago. And there was all this thing about how people shouldn't be able to work in them. And so I think we see this a lot of times, either when it comes to work labor fields that are either dominated by women or dominated by immigrants, then you have that it especially applies, especially if people wanting to come in and say like, no, we need to save workers, we need to save people from being able to make these decisions about how they work, even though they're adults and are ostensibly consenting.
Well, I think the gig economy is one of those areas where, again, the left and the right are very binary in their thinking, right? So the right's going to say they agreed to it, so they must like it, and the left's going to say, well, they don't have any options and they don't have any power relative to their employers, so they didn't consent to it. And I think the truth is that it's in the middle, and that my problem with the right solution to it is it seems to be you know, a supporting of the status quo, which I think is biased against workers and toward employers. But my problem with the left solution is that time and again, when they see coercion, they want to add more coercion to the situation. They want to solve the problem by limiting what employers can do. They want to solve the problem by shutting down the nail salon, shutting down the massage parlors, shutting down these options that are unfortunately the best options for these employees, or they wouldn't be working there. And so what I'd like to see libertarianism do is come in and say, how do we make this more cooperative? How do we open up more options for employees? Like, how do we empower workers relative to employers so that these decisions are actually fully consensual? Because they're not right now.
I'm actually surprised no one has talked about consent in the realm of children.
I was actually gonna get to
I
that.
was gonna
say
it's funny because I was thinking about it, and then like everyone's getting into very specific policy and like things like, you know, legalization, like right to try and things like that. And it's one thing that I've done a couple of talks about in at a couple of liberty-oriented events, where I've talked about consent relating to children and the way that we teach them about consent in the world. And part of that has to do with the way that we raise children. And I don't want to see policy that's like, you know, this is how you should raise children, but like,
this is
you know,
way to parent.
But right, but like right now, I don't want anyone to say like this is the right way to parent, but there are so many ways in which you can model consent to children in the way that they interact with the world. And because, you know, children are, you know, less empowered than we are, right? They don't necessarily have all the information to make the same kind of decisions that we do. Of course, parents and the authority figures in their lives are going to, you know, guide them in a particular way. But I often talk about this because I was raised not only libertarian, but my parents believed in peaceful parenting. My parents did not believe in spanking or anything, you know, any kind of punishment like that. And my parents tried to make my life, the way that I interact in the world is as consensual as possible through and peaceful as possible in all the things that I did. And so, so part of that is about teaching children how to identify boundaries. And so one of the examples that I actually talk about is and actually the feminist movement by itself, like on the left side, has actually hit this before, and I'm like very proud to see it, is talking about like when children don't want to hug a family member or something. And so being able to, you know, you're having a family gathering and, you know, you got your little kid and you're like, oh, grandma's leaving. Do you want to say goodbye to grandma? And teaching a kid that it's okay to say like, no, I don't want to hug them. And, you know, and so maybe a handshake, maybe a wave, maybe a, you know, just move on. But like teaching that kind of an interaction teaches kids how to articulate their boundaries, and it teaches everyone around them how to listen to those boundaries. And like, I actually have an article where I wrote about when I was 4, Santa Claus, like I was at a family, my dad's work gathering, and there was a Santa Claus, and Santa Claus saw that I was the only kid that didn't go sit on Santa's lap because I just wasn't a Santa oriented kid. And Santa went over and picked me up without warning. Like, and so like, I mean, he was trying to be nice, right? It's like, you know, like the best intentions, he's trying to pick me up and be like, hey, little girl, what do you want for Christmas? But I grew up in an environment where my consent was completely honored. And so, so I screamed a blood curdling scream and kicked Santa in the shins and then ran away. And afterwards, like what happened is, you know, like obviously people were like, what the hell just happened? Santa explained that he was just trying to pick me up and give me a present, whatever. And then he said, like, your kid kicked me in the shin. And my mother was like, well, of course she did. That's what she's supposed to do if a stranger picks her up. And so then, like, what was great is that, like, mom had me come out from, like, my brother actually had to, like, get me out from under the Christmas tree at the Christmas party. And literally, like, my mother set us next to against each other and was like, Santa, do you have something to say to my daughter? And literally like made him apologize for not asking before picking me up. And like, and it's funny because I write about how that has dictated the way that I deal with like a lot of interactions. I'm very strong at like articulating my boundaries and about like making sure they're heard. And I wish that more people, more women, more men, everyone was more was taught more of that. And so I feel like that's something that we talk about in the libertarian circles, where there's a whole peaceful parenting movement, a whole unschooling movement. I mean, education is another thing that like kids don't have much consent regarding, and like, and there are different ways that people can be consenting to education, and instead of just being forced to, you know, like to have to send their kids to schools and having to give their money towards schools that they're not happy with. But when it comes to like young people and consent, particularly around that issue, around being able to articulate their boundaries and the way that their parents are raising them, there's so much that can be done there to model good behavior and to like help in the future for their consensual interactions, whether it be with an employer or with a partner.
Leslie, did you want to hop in?
No, I was just going to say the same thing. And that the Girl Scouts of America have been really great in the last like decade or so in pushing out PSAs every holiday season, encouraging parents to respect their children's boundaries when it comes to family, hugs, and affection. Mm-hmm. So that's been nice to see. And I'm looking forward to seeing what this wave of consent with children brings about with the next generation, how much stronger they're going to be.
Once they get to college, once they get older, I think it's really going to be helpful to them.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and switch to some of the more sexual-oriented consent questions. We often hear the phrase "believe women" or "believe survivors." I personally think that this is something that a lot of people really misinterpret or misunderstand, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on what you think of those phrases, and you know, if you think that they're good to use, or what do you think is meant by them?
So I think that what I take away from them is that when I looked into the statistics, it was something like less than 10% of rape allegations are false, but something like the average person assumes like 50% are.
I think it's like 1% that go to court too.
Yeah. So so like, yeah. So the VAT, like the we have a problem of we are completely wrong about sexual assault survivors making it up. And then we are focusing so much energy onto the problem of false reports, which is again tiny, and utterly ignoring the problem of the vast majority of rapes go unreported. And to me, that's just a clear example of misogyny. And so, and in the same way, I think that believe women to me doesn't mean no women are making it up. We know about 10% do, or that's the best data we have. It's that the default should match up with the reality. What we believe by default should match up to the reality that we understand it. It shouldn't be a misogynistic assumption based on false data. And so I think the idea that it means believe all women is itself an example of misogyny, where people are intentionally misconstruing and misrepresenting the goals of the, and even if it's not, like, just take it as it's useful, right? Like, see it in the way that it's most useful to you, which is what I'm doing, and saying like, hey, we have a problem here. This phrase is pointing at that problem and offering a potential solution, which is, let's not assume women are lying when we don't have the data to indicate that that's a reasonable assumption. It doesn't mean no due process, right? It doesn't mean that people shouldn't have the benefit of the doubt, and we shouldn't fact find to determine guilt or innocence. But it just means half of women are not making it up, I guarantee you.
So I'm in the same camp of believing that the phrase "believe all women" or "believe survivors" is a useful tool. The way I view it is that it is encouraging a culture change where we default to believing survivors, because of this low false accusation rate, which RAINN recently estimated between 2 and 8%, which is a fairly large range.
So RAINN is, can you just give out the whole acronym so people know? Rape?
Yeah, RAINN is the Rape, Assault, Incest, something network, national network. Okay. They're the leading rape and sexual assault think tank and researcher in the country. Anyway, 2 to 8% was their finding, which was pretty wide. But the interesting thing to me is that it matched up in false accusations for other violent crimes. Mm-hmm. So assault in general, robbery, all of these have the same rate of false accusations. But when we encounter an accusation in the social realm for these other crimes, the default is not, oh my goodness, there's all these false accusations of robbery or of theft or of violence. We don't go there. We only go there when it's a rape or a sexual assault. So to me, believe all women means to believe them at the same rate that you're going to believe any other violent crime accusation in the social realm.
Yeah, definitely. That's how I always explain it to people. It's, look, it's not believe them in the face of all evidence to the contrary. It's just, if someone tells you, hey, my car was stolen, you then go investigate it, assuming that the car was stolen. And if you then find evidence that the car is sitting there in their garage, you go, hey, looks like your car wasn't stolen. What's up? And it's the exact same thing. You're just saying, when someone comes with a claim, assume, at least in the beginning, until you run into evidence of the contrary, that it probably happened. Now let's go investigate it and see whether or not it did.
Exactly. I always think of it as like a recalibration of assumptions. Like it's just about like, you know, there are a lot of assumptions out there. And I mean, and I know also that like the people hearing some, like your own experiences in life will kind of color how you might assume something. You know, if you had a sister or mother that was sexually assaulted, and then you hear somebody says they were sexually assaulted, you may be more likely to like hear that and you know, and go, oh my God, like, yes, like, and assume yes. But you know, if you know, you got a buddy who was accused maybe socially, and then you're like, oh, but he didn't do it. But like, then it starts to kind of color your assumption, you know, like, oh, I knew one bitch who lied about that, therefore I think that more people lie about that. And so it's about kind of recalibrate your assumptions, you know, like, obviously, like, overwhelming evidence to the contrary, fine. Like, but like, as you know, as you guys just discussed, like, we should be, you know, at least hearing anyone out, hearing what they have to say, and making sure that we follow up on that the same way we would if a car was stolen or any other crime was committed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a good place to transition into another kind of rub we have when we're talking about sexual consent. One of the common concerns that we hear a lot from folks is this idea that people, mainly women, might simply regret consenting after the fact and then claim that they did not consent. What do you think of that? When is consent ongoing? When isn't it? Do you think that that's an actual phenomenon that's happening? Because I feel like that's something that anytime anyone brings up consent, there's always somebody who starts talking about, oh, well, they just regretted it, right? And so like, I really want to like dig into that right here.
So I think that a lot of this comes in that gray consent area, or that non-binary consent area, and a misunderstanding of consent, particularly a difference in consent levels between partners. There have been cases in my own life where I am sure that the other person thought I was consenting, but never checked in. There was no enthusiastic consent. And there are times when I would call that rape, or just a misjudgment of consent. Mm-hmm. It just depends on how much of a difference those levels of consent between the two partners is. And I don't think the idea of women regretting it is an accurate portrayal of these misaligned levels of consent.
Yeah, I think it
But I
almost
think,
comes. I'm sorry, please continue.
sorry, I think it's a reflection of this binary thinking that Kathy was talking about, where it's either consent or not consent. I think this definitely falls somewhere in the middle. And this is what we're trained to respond with, that she regretted it because it has to be 0 or 100.
Go ahead.
One of the reasons we wind up in this trap just is because all of this gets caught up. It just becomes like another cudgel in the culture war. So you have, people being like, is it believe women or is it believe all women? As if that's really the difference, when, the difference is more about like everyone said before, like giving people the benefit of the doubt, no matter what the phrase is. It's, you can take it sort of the same way, no matter how you say it. And the same thing here, because we're really just sort of talking about the same thing. And we can't have these conversations because everyone, again, wants to use them to like advance their argument about how either like women are always lying about rape, or victims are always lying about rape, no matter their sex or gender, or to be like, no, we need to change all, get rid of all due process standards because of this, which also, has been like another bad phenomenon in sort of feminist activism, especially like in the 80s and 90s during like crime war panic, was them sort of pushing bad legal standards on the basis that victims need more, need different standards. Sexual assault victims need different standards than other crime victims. And, I think that's bad just as a matter of principle, but also, of course, it ends up then coming down, hardest somehow on victims and on women and gender non-conforming people and sexual minorities too, because that's how criminal laws always do. So I think one of the reasons we just wind up in trouble so much when we're talking about these like nuanced versions of consent is because we also don't differentiate between consent violations and criminalization. We're sort of used to thinking like if consent was violated, it was a crime, and thinking that it's either, like we said, like, it's either consent violated or not, and not different degrees of it. So we're just thinking like if consent was violated, if it was non-consensual sex in any way, or if any part of it was non-consensual, like that is rape. That's what people will say, and that sort of shuts down conversation. Like, no, that's rape. So I think, you kind of have it in both ways, where we just want to shut it down instead of being able to talk about the fact that like it's a gradient, and there are different levels of consent, and there are also different solutions to them. Like not all sort of consent differences are, or not most of them, or any of them need to be, except for most of the things that involve force maybe need to be criminalized. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion there that we can't have sort of in our current cultural environment.
I do think with that, I think that there's also, when it comes to the consent conversations that we're having, like I'm so grateful that consent is now like a common topic, but it wasn't previously. It was not something like when I first started, like, obviously my parents were like ahead of the game in talking about consent as a thing that I apply to other things in my life. But like I knew the terms consent, but like, it wasn't like a big conversation thing when I was 18, 19, 20 years old, like versus like now I'm 33. And so I find that a lot of times when we're having discussions about consent, a lot of times we're talking about just like, we're having these descriptive kind of like background conversations of like, hey, here were past interactions and were they consensual or were they not, right? Versus like prescriptive, like, hey, this is how you can judge whether or not, like in your future interactions, if they're consensual. And I think that what sometimes happens is that we haven't had as many, like we hadn't prior had as many conversations about consent. We are now. And so a lot of people are going back, they're digging into their own sexual histories and they're going, wow, like this thing wasn't that consensual. Oh, this thing had a lot of consent violations. Oh, this thing was definitely not consensual. Oh, I like, and sometimes like I would say that there are situations in which someone goes back and regrets something and may or may not feel that there was like consent, like wishy-washiness there because maybe they didn't get, checked in on or whatever. But I think that a lot of times we'll kind of be reacting to like past experiences prior to having the language for this. And so it ends up putting us in this conversation about like, oh, these things in my past were not consensual. And like that's helping us create the dialogue, the verbiage to be able to describe how we'd like sexual interactions to be in the future so that there's less of this, right? Like if there is a percentage of women, say, or men or anyone who's, you know, who like regrets something afterwards but calls it a violation of consent, we want to like help like work out that like, hey, let's talk about what you're actually experiencing and whether or not that was regret or whether that was consent or lack of consent or an intense like consensual violation or what, like what, you know, where is it on the spectrum?
And
because
what do we do to prevent it?
Right, what do we do to prevent it? Because the entire idea is that like if there is a percentage of people who are regretting but calling that a violation of consent, if there is a percentage of that, whatever it may be, whether it's 1% or whatever percent, we'd like there to be less of that in the future. And the way to have less of that in the future is to have those communications now, to say, like in the future, you want your partner to be enthusiastically consenting. You want, you know, you want to have these ways of checking in, to like feel out body language, to feel out, you know, to actually be able to be like not scared of having a conversation going, hey, is this okay? Hey, does this feel good? Hey, like, you know, can I do this? And like lots of people, as we've said before, like a lot of people are scared to have those conversations, particularly because the way that people romanticize about sex, they don't want to like have explicit conversation about sex. And so they're like, oh, but if I have to ask if I can do this, like is it spoiling the mood? And so we're trying to change the mood. We're trying to like make it so that those things can be within the mood so that people can have these conversations so that like
enjoyable and still make it actually enjoyable.
Exactly. And so I mean, I feel like a lot of consent conversations are us like like talking about our past experiences, because that will help us create a blueprint for future. And you know, so there's a lot of people, like I have guys in my life who, you know, friends of mine who will say, I'm not sure I was always being consensual with like partners, but I don't know what to do about it now, because I like now I have the verb, like the understanding. But like, what do I do? Like, do I go back and apologize to those people? Or do those people think I raped them? I'm so sorry. Like, what do I do? And it's that, you know, we're in this space right now where we're dealing with a past and then trying to help make a future that's better. And so I understand why people get like defensive and wishy-washy about it. And like, and I think that it helps to talk about it as a spectrum, to talk about it like we're trying to make a situation where like these like the idea of two people having sex and like afterwards somebody feeling it was rape and the other person being surprised that the other person felt it was rape. I'd like less of those situations. And the way to have less of those situations is to have these consent conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it also has to do with the changing cultural norms around this. Like for a very long time, so I think this idea that women would regret having sex that they actually enjoy, just regret people knowing that they had this sex, comes from these sort of like very Victorian norms that women aren't supposed to enjoy sex, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of those norms are still sort of in our culture, even as we've sort of been moving forward into this idea that, well, actually everyone can enjoy sex and it's a good thing. And in fact, you shouldn't be having sex with people who aren't enjoying it. And that's a much bigger problem, right? Because, you know, we still have these ideas. So a lot of people still think like, oh, okay, like if someone says no, they're saying no because they're being coy and we should keep pushing past the no. And that's what's romantic about it. And I think a lot of people still have these ideas of, okay, but like I've had conversations with people where they're like, no, but she wasn't crying, like, so she liked it. And it's like, no, that can't be your bar for if this was good or not. Like that's not a, like there, you have to raise that bar, but it's hard to do that when a lot of people are still operating by these very old norms.
I think the old norms is definitely a problem. And I also think that because our society is set up to be in such a way as to privilege men so much, and because of our assumptions about gender, that when you talk about enthusiastic consent being a good standard, people immediately go to criminalization. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a totally unacceptable standard for criminalization. It's like, bruh, like 1% of rapes even get reported. 99% of those never see any moment of jail time. So we're not talking about a legal standard here. We're talking about a cultural standard. We're saying when two people come into a sexual situation, what should they think of each other and themselves? And that is enthusiastic, clear consent. It's not she didn't cry or she didn't say no or she didn't push me off her. It's I know because she said so that she wanted everything that was happening. And I did too, right? That is the cultural standard that we should all be aspiring toward. And we just derail ourselves and we go right to criminalization.
Right. And I think particularly for libertarians, where we talk about things like we don't like the idea of a social contract because it implies consent that we didn't actually consent to, this should be a fairly easy concept to understand.
Right.
One of the problems is that we also, I mean, there are people, not just women, but, you know, I think people, no matter what their gender or sex or sexuality, there are people who like the whole being pursued and that being a sort of part of the eroticism, or the saying no, you know? And so I think that's where people get confused, and they'll be like, well, but some people don't want, you know, enthusiastic consent. Some people don't want, you know, people have rape fantasies or whatever. And it's because we're, you know, we're all mixed up in how we talk about this, because obviously people do have these sort of fantasies, but they're not things that should just be sort of sprung on people, right? Like the fact that this is talking about, like, this enthusiastic consent doesn't mean that you can never have these like role-playing scenarios, or that you can never sort of negotiate these specific consensual boundaries within your own existing relationships. You know, existing relationships even being like you've hooked up once before or whatever, and then, you know, talked about it. But you've got to talk about it at some point. So that's the thing we forget. Like, you don't need to always in every single sexual encounter, you know, be doing the like ongoing consent and asking people about it, like in this way that people parody, like, can I do this? Can I do this? But, you know, you have to find ways to either talk about it in advance or either just check in with your partner and things like that.
It's just incredible to me that people aren't embarrassed, because if I hear, oh man, talking about sex ruins the mood for me, or I find it really off-putting, I'm just like, you must be terrible in bed. Like, if you really can't just have a conversation about what we're going to do or what we want to do or what we want in bed or what we like and don't like in bed, maybe you're not adult enough for sex. Like, maybe you're not ready for it. And so, like, I just think that it's a totally reasonable thing to say, you know, whatever you want in bed is fine. And you don't have, like you're saying, Liz, you don't have to say it every time, but like, you should be able to have one conversation about it and be straightforward about it and not be embarrassed about it. That's part of being an adult.
Kathy over here with some hot takes.
But good takes, I think.
Yeah, good take.
I hope so.
But hot take. One of the things that I do, and before the pandemic, I dated a lot, and I still plan on dating a lot. One of the things I do early on in like the OkCupid or the Tinder conversations is to bring up how I like to be pursued. And I think that's something that we could start bringing into the conversation. And as somebody who has been in the BDSM scene, since I could legally be in the BDSM scene, these conversations around like consent and building contracts can be sexy. They can be thrilling. You just need to have them. You can do a consensual non-consent scene and have this thrilling, oh, I'm going to say no again and again and again. But you just need to talk about it and make sure that the other person is on the same page, that that is an acceptable way to go about having consent. Because you saying no can make the other person feel rushed as well. So I think we should normalize this idea of like the contract. And it doesn't need to be a written contract like that horrible SNL skit from years ago. Just a verbal agreement of how things can go down is an extremely helpful thing.
So we have so many great questions in the comments that I want to leave space for them. However, Leslie, you actually like hit on one of the other things that I wanted to ask about, which is this sort of like hyperbolic idea of a sex contract or sexual consent contract, right? Which I think is something that particularly gets joked about a lot, joked or not joked about a lot in the libertarian space, right? Like, do we need to have a contract that people sign prior to having sex every time, where they say, I so-and-so consent to have sex with so-and-so, right? And like, what are your thoughts about that kind of thing?
I mean, I think for elaborate BDSM scenes, having written contracts is a good thing, particularly when you're protecting yourself against legal ramifications if something you're doing may be construed as violence. But for everyday sexual interactions between people, a verbal agreement, it doesn't need to be written. And I think it's, as you said, hyperbolic to go to this extreme of writing a single contract for every single interaction, but having a understanding of consent with each and every partner that you have is the only way to go about this.
Yeah, I think the goal should be for consent to be explicit and enthusiastic. And so it's whatever's required to get there. If you need to spell it out and write it down, do it. If you can get there with just speaking it, then do that. Like, do whatever's required. But the goal would be to have everybody be on the same page about what's going to happen.
So
Yeah,
sorry.
No, Albans, go ahead.
So what's funny is I have a friend named Erin Tillman who wrote, she's known as the dating advice girl there in LA, and she wrote up a book that's called the Consent Guidebook. And one of the things she did was she actually like asked people to contribute with things about like how to make like those consensual conversations, those explicit conversations about sex, like sexy and fun and intimate and stuff like that. And I was going to bring this up before is that like I shared a story in that particular book that, so it's like I just realized, I'm like, wait, I'm in another consent book. But specifically because like I had a situation where like I wanted to kiss someone and I wasn't sure like if he was into me, whatever. And so what I ended up just saying to the guy was just like, what would you do if I kissed you right now? And then he responded with like, well, I'd have to kiss you back. And I was like, well, let's do that. And then we had a great makeout session. It was like the hottest fucking like time I've ever done that. Like, I was like, this is great. And what's great is her book like talks about like how to have like what these conversations can look like in a way that's still sexy, in a way that's still fun. And it's like, and you know, and I'm the queen of like, of being like really explicit to the point where my partners have like kind of gone like, oh, okay then, like, you know, when I've literally like sat down with the guy and like had a drink and be like, I'm going home with you tonight, but just so you know, there's gonna be condoms and I don't do anal and I don't swallow. Like literally, like I will sit there and say these sorts of things and the guy will be like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm down with that. And like, we'll shake hands, like literally, like, because it's fun and it's playful. But yeah, I think that people like should be able to communicate this to their level of explicitity that they're comfortable with, but they need to get more comfortable with being able to have these conversations and for it to look any number of ways that make them that they can make like. It's funny to me because like a lot of times I'll hear like guys being worried like, oh, what, do I have to have a contract? I'm like, well, what would make you feel comfortable having sex with somebody if they can call it rape? Like what is your level of comfort to like because you should want to be comfortable. You should want to make sure that you're like what you're going to be doing isn't going to bite you in the ass. So why don't you want to participate in like something that's not going to bite you in the ass? Like please like participate in this thing.
Can I respond to two things Alvin said real quick before, so that we can get to questions. But first, you know, for people for whom that level of, I mean, I explicitly saying things all the time is sort of like sounds mortifying and horrible to me in sexual encounters. But I think so it's also important to emphasize to people that you don't need to do that. Like it can be, you know, it can be as simple as saying someone something at the beginning, like if something isn't okay, tell me, or if something isn't okay, let me know, okay?
Yeah.
Or you know, if I'm doing anything you don't like, say no, or you know, just even emphasizing, you know, that if something is wrong, that there's room to speak up, that you're not sort of you know, for either partner to say something like that, maybe the one who's more initiating it. I think that, you know, that can be a way to start initiating consent. You know, it doesn't have to be like saying like explicitly, like, can I do this? Can I do this? It can be just telling the other person, like, please speak up. Which is the other thing that I was
like, you know, that.
Yeah. And yeah, like, yeah, is this okay? Do you like this? Which is the other thing I think we need to talk to people too about how to say no or say when they don't like things, which is something we don't talk about a lot because we've really gotten this idea that, you know, like, that's victim blaming and only rapist cause rape and blah, 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 which is all like well and good as a theory. But like when it comes down to actually, then it's kind of this point where that prevents people from any sort of talk about like how people, especially young women, might be uncomfortable expressing their sexual desires and saying no. I mean, it's devastating to read some of these stories about people who then later talk about bad sexual experiences that, you know, some newspapers will have been deemed rape or whatever, but it's just like, they're like, well, I didn't think of it like that, but I also didn't say no because I didn't, you know, I froze. So many people just said I froze. And it's like, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are all instances of rape. Like, it wasn't the intent on the part of the person who was, you know, perpetrating it to be a rapist, but also it is a problem that so many people feel like they couldn't say no, you know, that's going to be a problem. So I think we really need to talk to, you know, people in general about also how to say no to sexual.
Yeah. On this point too, I also want to say, like, everyone talked about these very positive sides of contracts. Here's what I don't like about it, right? Because I think a lot of times with the kinds of people who bring this up, as I said, in a way that I think is honestly kind of hyperbolic a lot of times, what I see them as really pushing this idea is you signed it, so you have to do it, right? And consent doesn't work like that. Consent is ongoing. Yeah, yes, you can't say like, oh yes, I consented to that activity. I was consenting during it, and now I don't consent after it happened. But what you can do is, hey, at this point, this exact second, I'm no longer enjoying this, and I don't want to do this anymore. And that means it needs to stop. It doesn't continue. The consent does not continue past the point where someone doesn't want to do it anymore. I think that's also an important part of this.
That is a very important thing. The first time I had sex, halfway through it, I asked for it to stop. And at that point, it turned into a rape because it didn't stop.
Right. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. When you want it to stop, that's when it's not consent.
And that had been like pre-planned. Like, you could say it was under contract. Like, we had planned this whole night. Like, this was supposed to be intentional. Yeah, so this is where contracts can be broken.
Now, maybe like you've got something in your head that's freaking you out. Maybe like you're just bored suddenly. I mean, who knows? But like someone's not enjoying it for some reason. That's the moment where consent can be withdrawn. And that doesn't mean that prior consent, that means ongoing consent.
Yeah. I think this is the other half of adulthood, right? That, yeah, everybody should come into it ready to talk about what they want. But everybody should also be able to come into it able to talk about what they don't want and to be able to say, I don't want this anymore. And one thing that really disturbed me about the Babe story about Aziz Ansari was that the protagonist just kept talking about how she didn't want it to happen, but did it anyway. And I'm thinking, if you can't tell a person you're on a date with that, I don't want you to finger me, I don't want to give you, like, then you're not ready to date. Like, part of being an adult is saying like, no, thank you. And if they're being rude, being willing to leave. And I feel like, yeah, there's a certain amount of infantilization that's happening in some of the discourses around consent of women that I don't agree with. And that I think we need to emphasize that it's our responsibility to let our yeses be yeses and our noes be noes.
But I also want to say that we talked a little bit at the beginning about teaching consent from childhood. And I think part of that is that for a lot of people, they're sort of taught from childhood that you can't say no, that you can't say things.
Women especially,
which is why people freeze. So when I read that story, and I also want to say for a second here, I was actually going to transition into Nicole Yateman's question. So I will read it because we're basically talking about it. She says, how should the law handle the spectrum of sexual consent? And is it okay to use social shaming? I'm thinking of Aziz Ansari when someone misjudges another's level of consent, because that's exactly how I read that story with Aziz Ansari. It was, he thought there was consent. She was not consenting. But the thing is, it wasn't explicit, right? It was on the one side, someone freezing and being unable to, for whatever vast variety of reasons, to explicitly say like, I'm not enjoying this, and just feeling like they were forced into it. On the other side, someone who probably did not understand that that was happening at all, right? And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of these kind of negative experiences that aren't really necessarily rape, but aren't positive for people either, are happening.
So while I agree with Kathy's, we need to learn for our yeses to be yeses and our nos to be nos, I think in the case of Aziz Ansari and a lot of the other Me Too movement cases is we're ignoring the power structure that exists. So not only are women socialized to be demure and submissive and not to be able to express boundaries around our bodies, but when you add in a power discrepancy, this power dynamic, it becomes a lot harder to say no when that person may have the social class, the money, the wealth, the fame, or etc. that can be used against you. I hate to do this again, but one of my rapes was by a higher ranking official in the Libertarian Party. And at the time, I couldn't say anything because he had a chair position at a state level. And what am I going to do when I have to report to him? So
I think a lot of another thing that happens for a lot of activists or people who are part of a movement too is this feeling of like, if I say something, it's going to reflect poorly upon this movement, and people will use that to discredit this ideology or this work that I've dedicated my life to, which I think is also part of that like freeze reflex for a lot of people there.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that can come into play on whether women freeze or don't report or don't go public. And it's not just we are incapable of saying no. There's a lot of things that can go through a person's mind during that moment that makes us be quiet.
Yeah, we talk about fight or flight, but it's actually fight, flight, or freeze, and they're about equally likely reactions in people.
Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Yeah.
There's that new one. So
yeah, I actually brought that up in the article on consent is not a binary, that power disparities absolutely influence your ability to fully consent. And the example that I gave was you're in your last years of grad school and you have a thesis advisor and they want to have sex with you. Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't get a good recommendation from this person, you don't really have anybody else to turn to. It looks very bad. This is kind of your one shot. And so you can't really fully consent to that, right? Because you're not just taking into account whether you want to have sex with this person, you're also taking into account they have you over a barrel. So yeah, I think one of the keys to creating a consent culture is trying to recognize and flatten out these power hierarchies to an extent, that people who are in positions of power over people need to realize that those power discrepancies influence whether and to what extent people in lesser positions of power can consent to have sex with them.
I think it also comes down to enthusiastic consent, right? Because like in the Aziz Ansari case, maybe if he were more actively looking for her to be really excitedly into it, he would be like, hey, it kind of seems like she's not that into it. She's just going along with it, right?
Totally. He was totally a jerk in that article. I think that was pretty widely accepted, that I would want higher standards from anyone in a sexual situation, that if somebody's not seeming to be into it, that they would stop. But I just think that it needs to go both ways. That, yeah, I mean, he has more money, but it's unclear to the extent, which I don't know how much power he really had over her. But it's hard to say what she thought.
So I want to bring it back to Nicole's question on this. Like, how should the law handle that spectrum of consent? That's the hard question. I mean, I'll say in the Aziz Ansari case, I don't think that anyone broke a law. I think it was a bad interaction. I think it's not a good thing. But as far as I could read out of it, I don't think that there was anything that anyone should go to prison for, right? But there should definitely be, I think, maybe some level of social sanction, and also more than that, honestly, like calling in, like just like, hey, what can we do to change how these interactions are happening so that you're not having that interaction on both ends, maybe.
I think that as a matter of law, though, yeah, you do have to set very clear, you have to set very clear lines. You have to set very black and white lines, which is sort of the opposite of how this works, which is why we have to become more okay with like things being able to be bad sex, or people being able to be creeps without them necessarily being criminals, or without necessarily being assault or rape. because again, we get in this line where we feel like we're either saying like, well, this was either perfectly fine or this was a crime. And so we think that everything needs to be criminalized, where obviously like you can't have a standard where people cannot give consent and then, I mean, where people cannot like express a no, cannot give any particular indication, and a person is just supposed to pick up on the clues. Like that can't be a legal standard. Like we might want to say like Aziz Ansari, since we're using him as a sort of like stand-in for all of this, may have wanted to check in, and that may have put him in a better position. But we also can't say like it's the crime if you don't pick up on the cues, right, that someone is not enjoying it, if they are not like saying no, if they are not telling you no, if they are not like leaving or something like that. So I think you kind of have to make those lines more black and white when it comes to
Maggie Oskin has a good question here as well. She asks, what's that line between persuasion and coercion?
I think
it's all gray. That's what makes this hard.
Yeah.
And it's from person to person.
I think it's about how do you feel about the alternative? If to me, persuasion is there's the default, and then here's how this option could be better than the default. To me, coercion is here's the default, here's how if you don't do what I want, it's going to be worse for you.
Yeah.
I think that's the difference, but I'm open to other interpretations.
I mean, I think there's also a line where like if you get a no, you also have to understand like, is it a hard no? Is it a soft no? How hard are you trying to change that no, right? Is this something where it's like, okay, like this person sort of demurred it away from me, so like maybe I'll try flirting with them again sometime and see how this goes, or am I going to start harassing them, following them around, right? Those are two very different things.
And that's something that I brought up in the article, is that when you start badgering someone, then that becomes essentially a negative consequence. It's like, if you don't do this, I'm going to keep doing this. You don't want that, so do it. So I think that, yeah, persuasion is, this is why it would be better for you, and coercion is, I'm going to harass you until you until you acquiesce. Like, that's not persuasion anymore.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Like, coercion is about negative consequences, and persuasion is about positive consequences. Like, hey, these are great things that can happen, and nothing bad will happen otherwise. Like, yeah.
Just a really good way of putting it.
I agree, but I'm also cautious about using that as the standard, because it just provides a way for the harassment to be reframed.
Yeah.
There will be people who go, oh, but I'm just telling you what could be better about this. I'm framing it in a positive, therefore it's not harassment. I think the safest way for us to draw a line when it comes particularly to sexual consent is one no is no. Their persuasion is too flexible into coercion for it to be an acceptable motivator to get consent. I think once a person says no, that must be it when it comes to sexual consent, just because of the nature of that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a difference too between a no and just a like lack of interest in that moment, right? Like those are two different interactions usually.
I mean, asking for clarification in the moment, being like, is this a no, or is this a just not right now?
Can I ask again later? Yeah.
Yeah. This is where being explicit and clear benefits all parties involved.
Tristan Collins has a really good, hard-hitting question here.
Yes, he does.
I don't think an event goes by that I don't hear about a consent violation in the liberty community. Government, companies, or left-right convos are important, but I see this issue tearing apart the liberty movement. What are our options or potential for restorative or reparative justice in the larger liberty movement when individuals have experienced consent violations?
I think it's kind of funny that it would be a problem in libertarianism, because we, again, think of ourselves as so focused on consent. But I think that this speaks to two problems. One is that we can see consent as binary. and two, that we are hyper focused on government violations of consent, and we have a huge tendency to ignore individual to individual or system to individual violations of consent. I'm not an expert in restorative justice at all. I think I'm in my heart a prison abolitionist, but I don't have a lot of education on alternatives to prison. But I think that it's a great movement, and I like the thinking that's going on around it. I'm just not super familiar with it.
I will say that I think that this is a problem in the liberty movement, but in my experience, it's a problem in all movements. It's not just the liberty movement. Although I will say that the two things you called upon, Kathy, are specific to the liberty movement, and I think really get to the heart of why it's an issue in the liberty movement. There's also another problem, right? In that unfortunately, there are a certain group of men, and I'm not saying that this is a problem just with men. There are women who don't understand consent and push themselves on people in all sorts of ways as well. And I'm not trying to erase that. However, there are a certain group of men who really fundamentally see men as individuals and women as possessions of individuals. And I think that that's also unfortunately part of this rub as well. And so like they're not applying the same values or the same ideas about individuals and about consent when they see themselves as an individual, and when they see a woman who they have difficulty imagining themselves as, and I think this is why, and therefore are not looking at them in the same way, and not kind of humanizing them in the same way.
I think another one of the issues that makes these consent violations more prominent in the liberty movement is because we have this strong emphasis on consent, but we have the societal impacts and the way we've all been raised. We haven't been given the tools to recognize consent violations and understand what consent really is. So when they do come up, they become a topic of conversation because it is something we value so highly. So these small consent violations or these large consent violations may be dismissed or not talked about as much in other movements, but are talked about highly in ours because it is supposedly a value of ours. We just don't have the tools or the learning yet to overcome the barriers that we all have.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I don't know whether it's particularly bad in the liberty movement, but I will say that I'm part of a sex party community, sex positive sex party community, NSF, and in the Bay Area. And literally at every one of our parties, we have a consent speech. Before you're allowed to attend our parties, you need to be consent trained. This is enthusiastic, affirmative, explicit consent. And we still would have consent violations constantly. And the issue is that the vast majority of them were misunderstandings, just genuine, one person thought one thing and the other person thought the other thing. And it's because we are not used to talking about these things. We are so uncomfortable being explicit in our communication, knowing ourselves, being able to explain ourselves, where we're at, what we want, advocating for ourselves, demanding explicit, enthusiastic consent. And so that's why I'm so obsessed with sex positive feminism, is that I think because we're so squeaked out about sex, it makes these conversations harder, and it makes these misunderstandings more likely and ubiquitous. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And every community has these problems. Anytime you have sex, you're going to have misunderstandings, and that the goal is to make things legible, make things clear, make communication effective, and empower people so they can advocate for themselves and communicate what their boundaries are.
I do quickly want to clarify that when I say this is extremely prominent in the libertarian community because we hold this value, I believe it's prominent in any community that holds the value of consent. So I believe the BDSM, the sex positive swingers, kinksters, all of these communities who hold consent as a higher value than the mainstream, they're all going to talk about it more and notice it more. I think maybe the rate of the consent violations is on par with the general population or slightly lower, but it gets talked about more in our communities. So we're more aware of the issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We are running out of time. We still have a little bit. I want to ask a good question here that I see from Chris Hudson. Liz, I think you might have some thoughts on this one in particular. How much does the background of our punitive criminal justice system hinder progress on sexual consent?
Yeah, I think this gets at what I mentioned sort of towards the beginning, which is just that it definitely hinders it, because we can't have discussions, we can't have nuanced discussions about consent, except for in small groups like this, but we can't have them in any sort of wider audience, whether that's in the media or on social media or in policy circles, because people immediately lead to this dichotomy of either like something is a consent violation and therefore a crime, or it is not, and therefore totally okay. And it all comes back to what we keep saying over and over again today, but what is like the central issue in all of this is that we don't know how to talk about things in general in the US, I think, really, which maybe gets back a little bit to the libertarianism is consent culture idea more generally, which is that like we are willing to talk about consent and sex and other things too, and where there are gray areas, but how you address those through voluntary means and restorative justice and all sorts of things like that, without necessarily saying if crime consent is violated or not, whether that's sexual or otherwise.
I think one of the things that we can see this kind of very actively in, and I think because Liz writes a lot about sex work, is when we look at sex work and we look at the situations where people will talk about the number of like victims trafficked and like people who are sexual slaves or sexually trafficked or rape victims, but what we're talking about is like right now, like sex work is illegal, at least certain kinds of sex work is illegal. And therefore, when a woman is caught performing a sexual act for money, like it incentivizes her to say, this wasn't a consensual thing, I was forced into it. Not that, like, there are plenty of women who are, but it creates this thing where we no longer have an accurate take on what is that level of like women participating in sex work consensually or not, because not only are we socially saying, hey, this person is not good because they participated in sex work voluntarily. Like first we have that social stigma that incentivizes her to say otherwise, but also, or he or she, could be gender neutral. But also that the law will then like make it very hard for someone to be able to say, oh yeah, I consensually, like I was consensually involved in this sex work, because like it then messes up our whole understanding of this, like what the levels of consent are, because the government is saying like you can go to prison or you can be helped, like, and also then we have the social stigma.
Yeah.
And so like those things, like when we're talking about punitive actions for we're talking about laws regarding sex, we like noticing where like incentives then align to like bring about the wrong result. Like the result we want is voluntary consensual interaction, and so like not having bad laws in place, like making sex work illegal, which change the incentives about how people are going to report their own activities.
Just to add to that real quick too, like with and sorry, and then Kathy after this, but I think you were trying to say something too, but just the Nordic model of prostitution and criminalization too is this one that is popular in parts of Europe and in Canada and other places, and people are really trying to push it here in the United States now, and they're calling it the equality model, which all the eye rolls. But basically it says, that sex, that's what I was gonna say. It says, sex workers are not criminalized, but people who pay, or people who are selling sex or sexual services are not criminalized. People who are paying for it are. So it totally takes consent out of the equation, and it says, sex workers, which is usually largely coded as women too, women cannot consent, and then their clients usually coded as men, and they talk about this too, like they're men, like their consent doesn't matter. A woman can say yes, a woman can say no, a sex worker can say yes, a sex worker can say no. It doesn't matter. It is a crime to pay them whatever their consent is. But it's also very infantilizing too, like Kathy was saying earlier, because we're saying that, it doesn't matter what, if women consent, it just doesn't matter. So.
I think also a lot of sex workers, if they do get raped, if they do get assaulted, like they don't really have any legal recompense for that right now, simply because being a sex worker is illegal, right? And so like it swings that way as well.
Yeah, I think the one way that I've started to try to think about criminalization is it's probably a bad idea to insert more violence into the situation. Mm-hmm. So if someone violently assaults someone else, and especially if you're afraid that they're going to do it again, maybe arrest and incarceration is, it's not adding more violence to the situation than the thing that started the chain, right? But when it comes to selling drugs, selling sex, right, those are non-violent cooperative activities. And so for rape, I think there are rapes where incarceration and arrest would not be more violent than what was perpetrated. But I think for a lot of these situations where it's a misunderstanding, it would be more violence. And so I don't know. I'm still trying to think through this, but I do think that
I just, when I think about prison, like we still treat prison rape like a part of the sentence and a totally fine, funny thing that happens in this country, which I think is just disgusting.
It's so disgusting.
Absolutely. I mean, and inmates are strip searched and, denied access to medical care. I mean, there's a lot that's just
people on the
really
side of
violent.
The road are strip searched by cops who are just simply being detained, right?
Right. And going back to the sex worker thing, like a sex worker is more likely to be raped by a cop than to have her rape investigated.
Yeah.
Because of criminalization. So
let me see. Okay, so we are almost out of time. So I will ask you all one final question. I like to ask this with every panel that I do. In a couple sentences, what one or two things would you like people to take away from our discussion here today?
I'll go first. I would say that consent is a spectrum, not a binary, and sex does not inherently change the nature of consent. Our stigmas and our attitudes around sex change the nature of consent.
That's really good.
I guess I can go next. I mean, I actually agree that I think that consent is not a binary is a really is an important takeaway. And then I guess I'll be the advocate for the fact that by acknowledging the kinds of ways and that we can model consent in non-sexual situations can make us better at communicating consent in sexual situations. And so I'll harken back to my story, but teaching children about their own boundaries and teaching young people boundaries so that they can assert boundaries and so that they can listen to other people's boundaries. There is a two-sided, there's, obviously we have to deal with power dynamics and everything else, but at the end of the day, we need two things to happen. We need people to be able to assert their boundaries and their no's and their whatever, and we need people to be able to hear them. And both sides of that conversation are so essential. And both sides of that conversation are about consent. It's not just about asserting and it's not just about listening. It's about being able to accept both sides of that, and that can be applied throughout our lives. And by applying it throughout our lives, we can make ourselves more comfortable with the awkward, sticky conversations about sex.
That's good.
So I am gonna echo both Kathy and Avins here with the consent is not binary. With the language I've always used, that consent is a grayscale. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring up that it's not enough to use the catchphrase, the only thing that causes rape is rapists. That doesn't solve anything. We need to talk about what consent really is and what it looks like in the real life. You can't just say, I didn't consent, this person didn't consent. You have to talk about and show people what that consent looks like and what non-consent looks like, so that they actually have a roadmap to go off of, so they actually know what to look for.
Yeah, it's really huge.
I'll just add, that, consent isn't just sexual. That's one very important realm, and we need to be more nuanced in the way we talk about sexual consent. I guess that'd be number one. But two, we also should apply consent and principles of it to other realms, whether that be in, non-sexual relationships like romantic or familiar relationships, whether that be economic arrangements, just all sorts of things. We should, broaden this sort of consent framework to look at how we deal with so many things, and also where the appropriate lines are that government should come in and criminalization should come in and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank all of y'all for, I think, a really good, interesting discussion. I'm sad we didn't get to all the questions that are here in the comments. Maybe that's something that we can discuss a little bit after the fact, maybe do something else, because there's some really great ones. I want to thank all the speakers today, but I also want to thank everybody who tuned in. And I would like to thank Kitty Stryker and Jenny Wilson for putting together and organizing this whole International Day of Consent and the International Consent Festival. It's been really cool. I've participated in one other panel during the festival, and I've seen some of the other stuff people have been doing. It's been really cool. So please do check it out. It's #IDoConsent, and you can kind of see some of the other stuff that's happened with the festival. And please also check out Feminists for Liberty. You can find us at our website, feministsforliberty.com. You can follow us on social. We're at Feminist Liberty on Twitter, and we're at Feminists for Liberty on Facebook and Twitter. We also very recently started a YouTube channel. We'll be putting this video up there, and we would love some new subscribers on that as well. As well as our newly launched newsletter on Substack. So if you're on Substack, please do sign up for our newsletter. And if you liked this conversation, you like some of the other work that we do, please do donate. We're entirely supported by small donations from folks who care about the work that we're doing around libertarianism and feminism and consent and those kinds of things. You can donate at our website, feministsforliberty.com. But you can also make us your Amazon Smile charity. That's basically every time you shop on Amazon, Amazon makes a donation to us at no cost to you, which is kind of cool. Or you can check out our newly launched swag shop on Society 6. I believe there's actually we got these mugs, we've got a bunch of cups.
We've got a lot of things that have slogans on them, like libertarianism is consent culture and libertarians do it with consent. There's just a lot of consent in all things. There's just a lot of consent related slogans on there, so check it out.
It's super cool. We've got t-shirts, we've got decor, all sorts of stuff, and it's currently on a Cyber Week sale, I believe, where everything's like 50% off. So check it out. And what is our YouTube channel called? It is called Feminists for Liberty. You just look under Feminists for Liberty. Unfortunately, we're still so small because we literally just launched it. You have to look under filters.
Like 6 followers.
No, we now have 11 actually as of this morning. Like
double digits,
hey! But you have to look under channels when you go to filter, because we don't have enough subscribers yet to be popping up. But please follow it, because we would love to actually show up and search. But yeah, so thanks everyone. This has been really awesome. And check out the I Do Consent Festival. There's been some cool stuff happening.